Good evening. Welcome to all of you. It's wonderful to have you here for this opening presentation of the Sunday at the Abbey series for this year. We have invited 6 women writers to reflect on the work of writing and editing and all that goes with it, and to reflect on it as a spiritual practice. Like monks coming together for prayer, people who write for a living or who contribute major scholarly works or fiction or poetry have to show up at their desk at a regular time on a regular basis. And there's a genuine spiritual dimension to that practice, and that's what these presenters will explore. We're delighted to have Kathleen Norris to open this series. She was born in Washington, D.C., and when she was a child, her parents, John Norris and Lois Totten, moved to Hawaii, where she graduated from Punahou Prep School in 1965, okay? And growing up, she spent most of her summers in Lemon, South Dakota, which is where her grandparents, and that had a dramatic impact on her. She went east to Benedictine College for undergraduate work, which she completed in 1969. And in that time frame, right there in approximately 4 or 5 years, her strong interest was in poetry. In 1974, a major move, she inherited her grandparents' farm in Lemon, South Dakota, and she and her husband, David Dwyer, moved to Lemon, South Dakota. A big geographical switch, which Kathleen will surely speak about. It was here that she discovered the spirituality of the Great Plains. She also, at that time, then became a Benedictine oblate of Assumption Abbey in Richardson, and in 1991-1992 came to the Collegeville Institute, during which she worked on and completed really the book Dakota. A few years after this, she was again at the Institute and wrote a major portion of what became the Cloister Walk. She also served as an SJU regent in the late 1990s and early 2000s. She's well known, as you know, most of you probably know, for a number of publications, including Dakota, A Spiritual Geography, Cloister Walk, Amazing Grace, A Vocabulary of Faith, and Acedia and Me, A Marriage, Monks, and a Writer's Life. The title of her presentation this evening is One Writer's Journey, Benedictine Values as Muse. Please give a warm Collegeville welcome to Kathleen Norris.
Thank you, Abbot John. Is this a good mic? Working? Okay. I know years ago when I was studying to become an oblate, I was inspired by the liturgy and being at the Assumption Abbey, and I realized I was starting to write poems based on the Psalms, the Liturgy of the Hours, and one day I said to one of the monks, I think you guys are becoming my muses. And he said, well, we've been called a lot of things, but never that. So, to talk about my journey as a writer, I have to go back a long way when I was 6 months old, critically ill, facing surgery. My parents were told that I might not make it, but this was all taking place at Providence Hospital, a Catholic hospital in Washington, D.C., so there is hope in this story. But anyway, what for me, the most intense experience of my life, literally a struggle between life and death, occurred before I had any words to describe it. And I guess I've been looking for words ever since, sent on a writer's journey at an early age. For years, I was told that I had survived because I had a strong will to live. But as an adult, I came to wonder about that, and that wonder and doubt led to the poem I'm about to read. This poem came as a pure gift when someone happened to mention the little flowers called baby's breath. And somehow that took hold of me, and this poem took hold of me. It's called The Blue Light. The angels stood with their backs to me. I was 6 months old and dying. I had no name for them, for anything. They were cold, not like my mother. Just beyond the angels was a blue light, and like any child, I reached for it because it was pretty. I wanted to curl my fingers around it and hold on. The angels didn't move, but the blue light receded. Children are easily disappointed, and I wanted it so much. I lay in the hospital crib, angry, rolling my head and crying. It may have been one of the angels who picked me up and returned me to my mother. I don't know, but I knew my parents were as helpless as I. I learned it too soon. I learned to keep moving back through the pain. I had no name for it. And the nurse who fed me a bottle through the operation, the doctors working helplessly with all their skill. It was their world I learned to want. The love that moved me then still moves me. I saw the perfect backs of angels singed with light. I turned from them. I let them go. Well, that's probably as near a description as I'll ever make of that near-death experience. And as beautiful as that blue light was, it was the messy world of fallible human beings, this world that called me back, or as I say in the poem, I had to learn to want. Many artists have a sense, I think, from an early age of being other, being different, and other little kids are happy to remind them of that. My experience as an infant made me a weird little kid. When I was 4, my favorite song, my mom and I would go through the American book, Fireside Book of American Folk Songs. We sang a lot from that book. My favorite song there was, "I'm a poor wayfaring stranger." The words go, "Just traveling through this world of woe. But there's no sickness, toil, or danger in that bright world to which I go." Well, that made sense to me as a child. It still does. And that might help explain why Benedict's rule made sense to me when I first encountered it. Keep death daily before your eyes. Well, of course. We're on a pilgrimage here to death and beyond. I've known that since I was 6 months old. I believe that writing is a calling, as much as monastic life and oblation are callings. And in my experience, recognizing and responding to a call is difficult. It's seldom a clear path. For instance, I've always loved to read, and I thought I was destined to be an English teacher or a librarian. It wasn't until I went to college that I was forced to go deeper and see that writing was my path and that it was a spiritual path. Ironically, this happened at Benedictine, which is surely one of the most resolutely secular places in America. But a teacher there, the poet Ben Bellet, who might be best described as a closeted Christian, recognized the poet hiding in my closet and drew her out. In writing my first poems, which are terrible, by the way, I began to comprehend that one spiritual aspect of writing is a powerful experience in which you leave the world for a while and then you return. I think good liturgy offers us a similar experience, but I didn't learn that for years. As a young adult, after Benedictine, I wasn't looking for liturgy. I wasn't rebelling against religion, I just wasn't interested. After college, I worked for a poetry organization in New York City, and poetry readings became my church. It took me a long time to recognize that God was present even there, and God was still urging me along my pilgrim way as I worked with writers and began to sort out what kind of writer I wanted to be, or often I did not want to be. In my work, I was often dealing with monsters of ego and vanity. One potent example is the guy who got drunk nearly every night and listened to tapes of himself reading his own poems, trapped in a minor circle of Dante's hell. But one huge difference between writing and liturgy is that the writer works alone and not in a community. This means that a writer is on her own in figuring out how to return safely to the ordinary world after being absorbed in a creative high. In New York, I witnessed many writers who used drugs or alcohol to come down to earth. It seemed like an occupational hazard. Well, the Benedictine way of life was and is a godsend to me as a writer, because the ordering of the day into prayer, work, and recreation acts as a scaffold that can support my writing, even a lot of writing, even at a fevered pitch. And that was a vital, life-saving discovery for me. When I first came to the Institute at St. John's, I was finishing my first prose book, Dakota. In fact, it was accepted by the publisher while I was here in that fall. I was also beginning what became my second, The Cloister Walk. I also wrote large portions of my third book, Amazing Grace. And over one blessed semester, which something that took me completely by surprise, I was supposed to be working on something else, but instead I wrote almost a whole book of new poetry. That was a real gift. All of that creative energy, a burst lasting nearly 10 years, was supported and enhanced by the basic stability of Benedictine life that was offered to me at St. John's. Even better, the liturgy itself sometimes became my muse. I went to prayers and back to work and then to prayers again. Stability. And when that intensely productive period ended, as I knew it must, it was that Benedictine stability that kept me from sinking too far into despair. Keeping death daily before my eyes helped, as did the sense of God's presence that I had developed in over 25 years as an oblate. It's now, I think, 31. I could believe in God's presence even when I couldn't feel it. I could believe that God had called me to a vocation as a writer, even in the dry spells, even when I did sometimes wonder if my gift for writing had withered on the vine, if it was over. Even as I experienced and wrote about acedia. And when I started working on that project, actually, I did research for over 20 years, but I told a sister that I was writing a book about acedia, and she said, "Oh, when you take on acedia, you've taken on the devil himself," which was actually important. I was glad that she said that to me. It turned out to be fairly true. During the period of time I was working on it, my father died, and my husband died a year later. All of these events didn't help at all, but it all seemed to fit into what she had said. When you take on acedia, you're taking on a lot. And so I was doing a lot of caregiving during this period too, often having to set the book aside, do caregiving for my father and my husband. And I was exhausted, and after I had finally finished the book, and even finishing it seemed like a miracle to me, it took me almost 5 years to find a new passion project, something I cared about, I knew I had to write about. Not long after my sister Rebecca died in 2013, I decided that I should write about her and her troubled life. She was brain damaged at birth through medical errors in 1952, and she was just intelligent enough to understand what had happened to her. This made her an angry and difficult person. And my father used to say if she had been more brain damaged, then the advice that they got in the 50s to put her away in some kind of institution would have made more sense. And he said if she were just a little less brain damaged, we could elect her to Congress. But all of this, her intelligence and her limitations made her an angry and difficult person, but also lovable. She even gave me a commission before she died. "You should write about me," she said, "so I can be famous like you." That's a very typical Becky remark. So for the first time in years, I felt blessed to be working again, to feel like a writer. For months, that project would wake me almost every morning at 3:30. I felt like I was living like a Trappist for a while. About 3:30 in the morning, I'd get up, read my Psalms. But for the next 5 hours or so, I would write. And I want to share and this went on for, quite a long period, about 3 or 4 months. I want to share just 3 of the little vignettes. The manuscript is mostly vignettes. I want to share just 3 little ones with you. This is the preface to the book called Iron Man 3. Movies were one of the loves of my sister's life, and after her funeral, my brother suggested that we take her ashes to Iron Man 3. I had seen the first 2 Iron Man movies with her, and she enjoyed them immensely, happily declaring them to be action-packed. That was Becky's catchphrase for any movie containing a surfeit of car chases, gunfire, and explosions. She had probably heard the words action-packed once in a movie ad, and it stuck. And this was typical of Becky. Once she found a word or phrase that suited her, she would use it for years. Special was another one. As a child, she'd been called stupid, slow, retarded, developmentally disabled. When the phrase special education came into use, she seized on it. It was a relief, a word she was glad to claim. She would often use it with people she was meeting for the first time, especially if she suspected that they might expect too much of her. It was sometimes hard for people to tell how much that Becky really was brain damaged. She was disabled. Well, I remember very little of that 3rd Iron Man film except for the satisfaction of holding the box of Becky's ashes close to my heart and thinking how much she would have enjoyed the movie. And if I could tell her that we had taken her ashes straight from the church to the theater, I'm sure she would say, "Of course you did, I'm special." You might notice I have a pretty crazy family. This one is called, "You Can't Hit Me, I'm Retarded." Well, Becky found out that this line doesn't work with sisters, especially one who has witnessed you writing on a cement block wall with her first lipstick. I was 15 and Becky was 10. She knew what she was doing was wrong, and she knew that I knew she knew. Growing up with Becky, it was always a challenge to distinguish between what she needed to be held accountable for and what she couldn't help doing due to her disability. That fine line was always constantly in flux, which was probably a good thing. It kept me on my toes. But the day she destroyed my lipstick, I was certain she was being bad and she knew it. I forget if anything had triggered her behavior or if it was just plain mischief. I knew that hitting her would get me into serious trouble, but when I saw what she was doing with my precious lipstick, I was outraged and swatted at her with a handy book of sheet music. We were both yelling, and our exasperated mom broke it up. For years afterward, Becky would recount the story and tell people what she had said. "You can't hit me, I'm retarded." That was Becky in a nutshell, aware of her difference, just enough to try to take advantage of it. And Becky had breast cancer. She survived that. That was she's the only person I've ever met who looked forward to going to chemotherapy because she got so much attention. And unlike the group home she was living in, she got her own little TV set. And so she just loved going to chemo. She had a different perspective on things, and she lost her hair and she got a blonde wig, and she'd love to be, when I was out taking her to the movie, she'd say, "I'm her only blonde sister." I mean, she had all these things that she would do. And she survived that, but in about 2011-12, she came down with another form of cancer. It wasn't related to the breast cancer, and this is what finally killed her. But this is a little passage about how she was near the end of her life, which was remarkable. "We learn a lot about love. When Becky was in her early 20s and beginning to show signs of the bipolar condition that would cause such distress to her and the family over the years, our father wrote in one of the Christmas letters he sent to family and friends, "We learn a lot about love from her." I thought of this recently during a conversation with one of the oncology nurses who had treated Becky at the cancer center. "It was always a pleasure to see her," she said, adding that they work with many patients whose fears and anxieties make them so self-centered and angry that they're unable to relate to the nursing staff. "But Becky," she said, "once she got to know us and realized this was a safe place with her, she was so gregarious that she became a people magnet." She added, "There was no pretense with her, no hidden agenda. She was selfless." That word selfless stopped me cold, as it seemed to me that Becky had been neurotically selfish and self-absorbed for much of her life. I had always seen this as a defense mechanism that had served her well. So it made the transformation she'd undergone in the last years of her life nothing short of miraculous. As she aged, Becky became more genuinely interested in other people. Her personality became more like that of our father, for whom any stranger was a potential friend. For both Dad and Becky, the more awful their circumstances, the more important it seemed to them to establish and maintain these human connections. My father gave movie passes at Christmas to the nurses he saw regularly when he was being treated for aplastic anemia. One told me she'd been astonished at his ability to joke around, even on the day when he had received the diagnosis of that terminal condition and had to begin taking a blood thinner. She had described the dietary and other limitations imposed by the drug and said, "No running with scissors, Mr. Norris." And he shot back, "How about sharp remarks?" Seeing how Becky converted routine treatment sessions at the cancer center into meaningful encounters was inspiring. I suspect that techs doing a blood draw or nurses preparing a chemotherapy treatment are used to being ignored or resented for the manhandling they must do, but Becky was relentless. She would ask, "What drew you into this job? How long have you been a nurse? Have you always worked with cancer patients?" And soon she had another friend, a person she could hug when they met again. Well, I finally, after all those months of work, I finally had about almost 400 pages, and I sent it to my longtime agent and my editor. And within a month, they responded. They shot it down, told me something essential was missing, and that I should set this project aside and work on something else. I was devastated and stunned, but I've worked with both of these women for over 20 years, and I know that they're exceptionally good at what they do, so I felt that they must be right, even though I couldn't see the problem. I told myself I was being mature and even exercising humility in accepting their rejection. But after nearly a year of self-inflicted misery and inability to move on, I came to see that I'd really given in to pride. Pride had blinded me to the ways I was shutting myself off to lick my wounds. Pride had prevented me from picking myself up and beginning again. St. Benedict knew that it's hard for us to be willing to be a beginner. Well, I finally did get going on that new book project that had seemed impossible for so long, and that's where I am now, back at the Institute, back to work and to prayers with the community, although I am learning that walking up the hill at 6:30 a.m. is harder now that I'm 71 than it was when I was in my mid-40s. A little bit slower. My new project is on the subject of monastic formation and how it seems that the whole country could use a good dose of it. Listening, hospitality, humility. Well, writers are not known for their humility, and it does take a lot of nerve to write something and expect others to read it. Everyone has stories to tell, and my stories are no less important than anyone else's. The difference is I've taken the trouble to write them down. I've made time in my life for the discipline of writing, and it is a discipline. Writers are always beginning again with the blank page, and it doesn't get any easier with experience. And once we've written something, we have to take a cold, hard look, cut a sentence or two, rework a phrase, revise a paragraph for clarity, eliminate passages that might be dear to us but that the reader doesn't need. Revision is drudgery, but it's also necessary. And this is one way the Benedictine Muse has changed my view of writing. Now I'm concerned with being hospitable to my readers, figuring out ways to welcome them into my work, give them a good experience, and let them leave feeling that this encounter has been worthwhile. It's crazy. It's crazy as praying 4 times a day, every day. But writers keep writing and revising, knowing that the world doesn't care any more than the world really cares if Benedictines are praying. But we keep at it. And in the process, we face deaths large and small, deaths to pride, to self-importance. We keep at the meaningless work that we can only hope might have some value in the end. And the end that helps to give life meaning. We struggle daily with setbacks, disappointments, and speaking for myself, the dread of acedia. But as a writer, I find that the Benedictine stability and order can only go so far in supporting me. There's an inescapably haphazard and chaotic quality to the process of writing, and my job is to engage with that chaos and make something of it. When the breakthroughs come, they often seem to come out of nowhere, like that first poem I read. And of course, my only possible response is gratitude. The next poem I'm going to read is about something I happened to observe one day on a morning walk. I really needed this poem in my life, and I was grateful to sort of receive it. It's called, a really modest title, it's called Body and Blood. Body and blood. I am worn, spent, torn with sorrows. Still I walk in the blue light of dawn, and the sky upholds me. A crescent of moon, a wing of cloud, deep crimson, ascends in the east, tinting even the western sky. Stupid with worries, and they are legion. I stop to admire the weedy hollyhocks by a neighbor's backyard fence. I hear the bumblebee before I spot him, entering a blossom, his body quivering like an infant's mouth at the breast, drinking the milk of the world. That was a good day, or that was a bad day that turned into a good day. The mathematician Bernard Riemann once said that he did not invent differential equations, he found them in the world where God had hidden them. Now, bees and hollyhocks have been doing their dance for centuries, and one day I just happened to notice. I stumbled across a metaphor. I didn't create it. The insight and the poem came as pure gift, and I am grateful. The fear that writers have is that these gifts will stop coming. One of the worst times in many writers' lives, and it's even occasioned mental breakdowns and suicide attempts, is when a book is finished and at the printer. That can seem like a death, and unless you're already at work on something new, it can feel like a final death. I experienced something of that after Acedia was published, but I prayed that my heart would be open again and that I would be receptive to the gift of words. And although it took way too long, in my estimation, it took a while. Some new poems did eventually emerge, and I'm going to finish my presentation with 2 poems. This was inspired by a photograph one of my nieces sent of her 2-year-old daughter standing alone in an apple orchard. You know, the little girls love to go and, you pick your own apples. And in an orchard, it was a big family treat. But somehow this picture, she was alone. And I thought about how toddlers are so seldom alone because parents are nearly always close at hand. So I was really haunted by this picture. And it led me to reflect on what it means alone, and it actually gave me my first opportunity to write about my own feelings, that peculiar sense of being orphaned after the death of both of my parents. So it came to have a great meaning for me. The poem is called The Orchard. The child stands in half shadow, alone, her mother, outstretched arm, mottled by tree branches heavy with apples, all but disappears in the shadow and sunlight of late afternoon. It is late. We have learned to be alone. The mother and father gone, who once held us close, who framed our life within their own. The child will have a photograph, herself as an orphan on a bright autumn day, standing in leaf fall and shadow in a grove of trees. And of course, anyone who can do that with a picture of a 2-year-old toddler isn't right in the head. I mean, you know that, but it's one of those things. I was haunted by this picture. I couldn't figure out why, and then finally it started to come. Now, the last poem I want to read, it came as a pure gift, and it came last year when I had just arrived at St. John's to help celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Collegeville Institute. And a monk, bless him, told me that Father Mark was close to death. Father Mark, when I was on the board of trustees, Father Mark was one of my go-to guys when I wanted to find out how the monks were feeling about certain things that were going on with the board. He was a holy gossip in the sense. That word gossip actually originally meant a godparent, so he was wonderful, and I got to know him, and not just for that, but I always really enjoyed visiting with him. So I'm just so grateful that I was able to see him just a few days before he died and hold his hand and just be there with him. A few weeks later, when I was back home, these words came. And this poem is actually scheduled to be published in the American Benedictine Review. In accepting it, Terence Cardong wrote, and if you know Terence, this is a typical remark, "Even I understand this one will take it." So anyway, I just hope I can get through this. I don't think I've ever read this before. That's always a challenge to read a poem the first time. Death of a monk at Eastertide. His pale hand in mine, he coughs. I am in the great transition, he says, from life to life. He went before me, and that makes it easier. Shifting in the bed, he opens his eyes and looks at me, but it's not me he is seeing. His mother and father stand in the doorway. He brought them through their deaths. Now they have come to see him through his own. With a weary smile, he squeezes my hand and says, "Heaven is here." Easter lilies keep vigil in the Abbey Church. The morning after, his confreres sing him to his rest. The tolling begins and ends. Thank you. Whew. And what I always like to say is that I entertain questions. I don't necessarily answer them. But entertaining questions, maybe we can do some of that in comments. Oh. That wasn't a question. Comments.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. Could you say something just a little more to flesh out how you move from project to project and that important transition of bringing one to completion, but already, keeping a creative process going?
Well, in that 10-year period, that wonderful period, that wasn't so much of an issue because I knew I had to write Dakota. I was working on it. And then because I was spending a lot of time, around the time I became an oblate, at Assumption Abbey, I was going up there about once a month for maybe a weekend or a while. And then when I came here, and I realized I hadn't really intended to write the cloister walk. I was going to write a book about the scary words in the Christian vocabulary. That was my original title for Amazing Grace, was Scary Words, and my publisher said, no way. So we had to figure out something else. But I was actually working on because I had come back to church after almost 20 years away, so trying to deal with the words of the Christian vocabulary, which is pretty intense and overwhelming. So that was already in my mind, but when I got here, I realized I had to write about Benedictines. I never really had intended to. There were some wonderful stories in Dakota, the greatest pillow fight I've ever seen in a monastery. Number of things, fun to write about. But when I was here, I said, these people are a little bit like people in the Dakotas. They're hidden away, and nobody knows about them, but people should know about them. So I started working on that, and my editor and I realized I had two books. I had The Cloister Walk, I had Amazing Grace. It was this very intense period of writing. Didn't get much sleep for a while, but, and then there was another book in the back of my mind that came after Amazing Grace, because I'd always wanted to write about my wonderful mentor and friend, Betty Cray, a great friend of poetry. She was a good friend of Auden and Cummings and all sorts of people like that. She was just an amazing person to work for and very formative person in my life, almost like a second mother to me in New York. And so I ended up, that became the Virgin of Bennington. That's probably the raciest book I've ever done, because I was writing about college in the 1960s in the East Coast. I was writing about the poetry scene in the 70s. So, but anyway, that was always there. I always knew I wanted to do it. But one of the weird things was that even when I was working in Dakota, I was starting to collect material on acedia. So it was there, but I had to do these other ones first. So I had all of those books kind of lined up in a sense in my mind. And the acedia one I knew was going to be the hardest to write and everything. I didn't know it was going to take me so long and just, almost really kill me. It was a really hard book to write, and it's probably the hardest of my books to read, but because acedia is such a fun subject. I had to plow through, in my research, I had to plow through some of the most depressing literature in the world. E.M. Choran, the Romanian philosopher, he wrote a book called The Problem with Being Born, and he's serious about that. And a nihilist Russian novel written in 2000, published in 1915, where basically suicide is seen as the ultimate good. I mean, it's just, I was plowing through all this stuff. Meanwhile, my family's dying, and I'm caregiving, all these things are going on. And so I was just exhausted, and I really, literally didn't have anything in mind. A few poems might be coming there and there. And I kind of knew that would be a hard period for me, but I didn't know how bad it would be. But again, that Benedictine sense of stability, if I could get to a monastery, spend some time with the liturgy, all of that really helped, So, and I think one of the most profound things is that hospitality thing. And when I teach now, I say, writing is not self-expression, it's hospitality to the reader. And that's a whole shift that I blame the Benedictines for that. Okay, another question or comment. Can you, Dorothy?
Thank you, Kathleen. I loved your stories about Becky, and therefore I was very startled when you said that your agent and editor did not. And I want to ask you if you have some kind of internal sense of confirmation when you're writing something you think this is good. And other times when it is, you got to tell it's not so good, and yet the world may not confirm this. And so, how do you know?
Well, I think a lot of the vignettes and stories are really good. They didn't think it was a book yet, and they're probably right about that. They didn't think there was enough of me in it. There were other things they kept asking. They asked some questions about my family, and I did expand it some. After that first contact, because there were big pieces missing. Mm-hmm. And so I put some of them in there. And again, that is something I will come back to. I'm not going to abandon it. There's no way that I would abandon it, but I'll just have to kind of be working with my editor especially, who's brilliant. But we'll just see. It's just something that, I know the stories themselves, the little vignettes are good.
I wanted to ask a little more generally as well, though, if when you're writing, if you're having a good day and this is good, or if it's always struggle, or what's the range? Is there some kind of internal confirmation that you have when you've...
Oh, yeah, there are times when I know it's really good. There are other times when I think it's good and I look at it the next day and it's not. I mean, and when I say my first poems are terrible, they really are. I sometimes use them in writing workshops to show people, what a really bad poem sounds like, and that there's hope. You can actually learn to write well. But no, there is. If I'm really writing something that I know clicks and it falls into place, there's a kind of a celebratory mood that I get into because I know that it works. And I think the problem with the book on Becky, I'm beginning to sort of see that it didn't make a book yet, and but that day was not a good day when I got that. I was the last thing, because I knew I would have to write more, and I knew there'd be more coming, but to just have it the door slam like that was probably the worst day I've ever had as a writer. I mean, writers get used to rejection. I mean, I get form rejections. It never stops. You just, roll with that. But that was really hard. Personally, that was just a blow. Partly because the book was and is so important to me. Yeah. Renee. Don't ask me about philosophy, please.
I would want to give first a little anecdote from J.F. Powers when we were talking one time, and I commented on the word vicious that he has in, what is it called, Wheat That Springeth Green, or
That's a
in
great
which he's talking about this young guy and his relationship with two prostitutes. And he says, I said to J.F. Powers, I thought that word was so wonderful. And he said, it took me 2 weeks to find that word.
Oh, yeah.
And the question I want to ask out of that is, what about correction afterwards? What about going over a text? Or do you just deliver it once you're finished?
Never.
Go ahead.
Never. I mean, that would be delivering it when I write it. That would just be. What you heard tonight was about, the sixth draft, and then the seventh, because today when I went over it, I scribbled in the right word, took out the wrong word. That's a never-ending process. That's why writing really is a discipline, because it's like anything in life, really, that if you want it to come out right, you have to work at it. It's not, you might get a great inspiration and come out with a story or something, but you won't have the right words yet until you sit down and read it over, scribble on it. And I remember John Hassler came to the Institute one year to talk to us about that, and he said his process is actually very much like mine, like a lot of writers I know. You write something, you print it out. Often I start by longhand, but use a word processor. You print it out, and then you start scribbling. You take out. I took out one whole paragraph, too, from the talk. I decided I didn't need it. And those kinds of things. So this was a seventh draft, basically, which is pretty typical. I don't think I send out, I know I write Forgive Us This Day, and they usually get a 9th or 10th draft. And sometimes it's amazing, because I think I've got something that's pretty good. I've got that little bit of internal confirmation, yeah, this is working. Then all of a sudden I go, oh my God, there's a whole thing I can do here that I didn't see. And that'll be in the 8th or 9th draft, and that will make the piece. I'll tell you one of my experiences with Dakota, because my editor's Jewish and an observant Jew. I've been to synagogue with her in New York. And she's been here with her. When her daughter was 2, her husband's a violinist, and he was able to use the practice rooms here. He was auditioning when they got back to New York, so they had a wonderful time. And she came to Vespers with me, and she said, do they know how Hebraic this is? I said, yes, they do. Yes, they do. But they loved it. They loved it here. They loved it here. And but on Maundy Thursday, I was working on Dakota. We thought we were almost finished, and Maundy Thursday, the afternoon of Maundy Thursday, she called me down at the Institute. In those days, it was one landline phone. You'd get a phone call. She said, I think we're almost there, but I think you need to lose 100 pages. And as one of the other residents said, that would be every 7th page of the book. Just take out every 7th page. And it's Monday, Thursday. I'm actually singing in the schola. There was a 4-part schola that year, and I said, well, I'm going to be in church for a while over the weekend. I'm not going to have much time to look at it. I'm going, 100 pages. And I said, you just gave me my Good Friday meditation here. And what was amazing was when I started to really look, because she is a brilliant editor, I started to look, and I think it took me about 2 or 3 weeks. But 3 weeks later, 99 pages were gone. And that made the book. One chapter, it was easy. There was one little paragraph from that one chapter. One whole chapter went, so that was pretty substantial. And one little paragraph, I found a place for it. And I think she was stunned because I think she told me 100 pages because she thought I would take out 50. But, obedience here, 99 pages. And that really made the book. That made the book much, much better. But that's the kind of process that's why it's crazy. Why would anybody spend their time doing that? It's nuts, but it works. It really does help. So that's why it's a discipline, because you have to keep suspecting yourself of using the wrong words or overusing adjectives or doing all these simple, silly things that everybody does. And it's a discipline. But thanks for that question, Renee.
I've always envied poets and artists because you see so much more in life than we do, and your experiences are never ordinary. And my question is, are poets and artists born or are they made?
I don't know. I do a lot of ordinary. I mean, I really do. And the poems and stuff come out of ordinary experiences, like the bee and the flower. So I don't know that it's just, and of course you're a physicist, so you understand a whole lot more about the universe than I do. I mean, in a way, you really do. That whole physics and science fascinates me, but I don't understand much about it. But I think the world is big enough for physicists and poets. The world needs us, needs all of us doing our thing. But I wouldn't say it's. I actually have an incredibly ordinary life. It's just that every now and then this little bug hits me, and I have to follow an idea or words and play with them a while, and something often comes out, So, yeah,
I'm curious about your Lemon, South Dakota farm that you inherited from your grandparents. And I'm curious to know how that farm, that setting, influences your writing and affects your practice.
Well, my husband and I left New York City, Manhattan. We were subletting actually from a poet, and the last place we lived. And we moved out to this town, and actually my grandfather was a town doctor, so we were living in their house in town, the house my mother was raised in. And there were 2 farms about 20, 30 miles east of town that he had bought this farmland many, many years ago, and it was leased out. And so, and I knew the families, because I'd grown up, like one family, they had 2 daughters who were the same age as my brother and me, so I'd grown up going out there, and of course, we were sort of suburban kids or city kids, and I remember those girls just thought it was hilarious that we thought it was fun to go in the chicken coop and hunt eggs and pump water from the well. For them, it was a chore, and they looked forward to our coming because we would be happy to do their chores for them, things like that. So I had all these experiences, and then basically it was we had a sharecrop agreement that was a really fair one, because if the price of wheat went up, everybody, the farmer and we, and both the farmer and we got a little more money. If the price went down, it was a little less. So it was fair to everyone. And one of the great accomplishments actually that we were able to do, and my husband and I lived there 25 years, which we never expected. It shocked my parents. They couldn't believe we actually liked it there. They were both raised in South Dakota and left in the 30s, never really looking back. But we were able to sell that land to the people who'd been farming it. There were 2 young families, so that was something that was. But I think that landscape, that's where I discovered the Benedictine family. There were so many things out there, and it was, my husband and I felt that it would be a good place to write, sort of away from the literary hothouse of New York City. And we were right about that. And my husband was from New York, but he loved the plains. He just fell in love with it. And fortunately, because, but I think it inspired us to write a lot. And this is poetry mostly, and then when the farm crisis hit in the early 80s, I realized that story was too big for my little lyric poems. And so that's when I started writing essays and found that I actually had readers, people reading them. Doesn't happen a lot with poetry. But so that place really formed me as a writer in many ways. And then discovering the Benedictines too was a huge thing, formative part of my life, personally, but also as a writer. So, Roger, yeah.
Kathleen, thank you. This has been a delight.
Oh, thank you.
You've been quite open with us and honest about your feelings. I'd like to ask a question that's rather personal, and if it's too close to the heart, you know what to do with. We've been lucky enough to know each other for several years, and I knew your husband, David, quite well, and that he was a brilliant poet. He didn't mingle with us quite as freely as you too, but it was lovely to have him with us. In any case, I met you one time and asked you what you were working on, and you hesitated a bit, and then you said, well, I need to get David's things together, and I need to. So you were editing his poetry, and I thought of this when you mentioned hospitality just a moment ago. Were you really not having any ideas of your own, or were you busy offering hospitality to David, and did they have any relationship?
Well, I think I was doing some things of my own, but I think when I talked to you about that, I was very busy. David left a whole bunch of poems. He got a Bush grant, the Minnesota Foundation, the Bush grant for writing. So part of the time I was here, happily here with the monks. He was down in the South Pacific making a pilgrimage to Robert Louis Stevenson's grave and visiting these places he dreamed about as a boy. And so he wrote a lot of poems down there that I wanted to, and I have it with me here. I haven't worked on it any recently, but I really would like to get them out there and maybe do a book of my poems and his poems together or something like that. That's still part of what I want to do. But I think I was working on something. Wouldn't have been acedia, but I think I had a few little projects I was working on, like book reviews and some essays and things. And so I was doing something of my own, but that is a project that's sort of in the back of my mind, the back burner kind of that I do want to write about. But thanks for mentioning David.
Hello. You mentioned receiving and being grateful for what you receive. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the idea of, or the experience of learning as you write.
Oh, okay, because from just about every book I've done, I've had to do a lot of research, especially acedia, the Cloister Walk, Dakota, and so I really love to read. So like sometimes I'll be reading history, sometimes I'd be reading theology, monastic history, a number of different things. So I think, especially for my prose, I've always depended on research and learning more things about whatever it is I want to write about. Because, like especially with acedia, when I started that, I knew very little. I'd found that passage in Evagrius, in the Practicos, a description of acedia that just stunned me because I said, oh my God, he's describing half my life, and I never knew what this was called. And that's all I knew. And so I had to do a lot of reading for that. And I like reading, so I mean, it's always fun. And if I'm writing a memoir, I notice Trish Hampel is doing that, taking the me out of memoir. That's one of the titles of my workshops, and we've talked about this issue of, because if I'm writing a memoir, I always want it to be about something else too, not just me. So that means I'm reading and doing research as well. I like learning, always always have. Math is, my brain doesn't work that way, so math is kind of off the table, but just about anything else.
Kathleen, thank you so much.
Thank
Let's
you.
put our hands together for a fine, fine presentation.
And And I know Father Dunstan has made some special treats for us.
Yeah, just a few quick announcements. And that is, you'll find at the back on the table a list of the series that's there. Dorothy Bass is going to be having the next presentation on November 11th, and there are wonderful cookies there.
Yes, Dunstan's special.
Kathleen, thank you so much.
Thank you.